All right, good morning. I'm Julia O'Leary. I'm the General Counsel at Massachusetts Office on Disability. We're going to be talking about navigating indefinite reasonable accommodation requests today. This training is recorded and will be available on our YouTube page afterwards. A few housekeeping items. If you are not presenting or an ASL interpreter, if you could turn your camera off so that we can have the recording focus on the interpreters, that would be great. We do have interpreters here today. We also have a CART reporter here doing the captions, so you can turn your captions on by clicking the three little ... more button on the Zoom. There's also a link to the captions in the chat. Chat again, in case you need that. All right, so we've got a pretty quick training today, and then I have plenty of time to kind of dig into questions, because I think that, you know, when we're talking about indefinite reasonable accommodation requests, there is a lot of gray area, and that makes it, you know, challenging to navigate, but also interesting to kind of talk about on a case-by-case basis. So I'm happy to field questions at the end. So today we are going to talk about kind of a refresher of the interactive process and what your goal really is there. We're going to talk about tackling indefinite reasonable accommodation requests. We're going to go over a couple of examples, kind of the two most common ones that I see. And then I really want your questions. I know that people have questions because I've been getting them. So we can kind of talk through some of the stumbling points that you guys might be encountering. All right. So as sort of a refresher, the heart of the ADA reasonable accommodation process is this interactive process between you, the ADA coordinator, and the employee who is asking for the accommodation. And the goal of the process is to arrive at a solution that allows the employee to do their job without creating a hardship for the employer. So either an administrative or financial burden, or you know, a fundamental alteration to the job, such as waiving an essential job function. So the goal here is, how do we get the employee to be able to access their job and do their job without creating too much burden for the employer? And so that necessitates a sort of back and forth dialogue. So there's going to be, as you guys know, and as you do every day, this kind of conversation with the employee. But I think it's helpful to keep in mind, especially when we're thinking about these indefinite kind of requests, that the goal is to find that compromise solution. And so that doesn't mean that the employee necessarily gets exactly what they're asking for. It doesn't mean that the employer gets exactly what they want out of the situation. You're gonna arrive at a compromise. And the goal is, as always, so that the employee can get their job done. Because at the end of the day, as employers, that's our bottom line. We want to make sure that the employee is doing their work and succeeding in their work, so that we're sort of getting what we need out of them, right? So Part of this interactive process usually involves a review of medical documentation, especially when you're getting into the territory of an indefinite request. Because when you're talking about something that has, pretty strict boundaries, the need for the accommodation is probably going to be more clear. Once you're getting into the territory of kind of an indefinite change in the workplace, that's when you might start having questions about, is this medically necessary? Sort of what's going on here? What's the background? So it's always okay to ask for medical documentation if the relationship between the employee's disability related limitation and what they're asking for isn't clear. Unfortunately, as I think we've all experienced, sometimes that medical documentation itself comes back pretty unclear. Sometimes it doesn't speak at all to the sort of expected duration of the need for this particular accommodation. And that can be really frustrating for you as the ADA coordinator, because you want something in black and white to be able to point to justify why you're arriving at whatever decision you're arriving at. You aren't really bound to what is written in the medical documentation, though. So if, say, the documentation says, this is a permanent condition and it's not anticipated that that the condition is going to change over time, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to grant a request in perpetuity. It means that you have some more information about what the employee is expecting in the future with respect to their accommodation. And maybe that means that you can have, longer intervals before you're reviewing the request again, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to make it permanent if making it permanent isn't something that's going to work for the agency. And, I think that it's important to be careful, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. I'm kind of jumping the gun, but, just because something is in the medical documentation doesn't mean that you have to sort of follow it letter by letter. Just because something isn't in the medical documentation doesn't mean that you can't ask for it. So say you get this really vague doctor's note, which I think we've all got. It is okay to ask for a release to speak directly with the provider. Sometimes that can be really helpful. Oftentimes, just to be, realistic, it's not very helpful because the provider either doesn't want to be pinned down or doesn't really understand what their role is in the process and thinks that, the more they emphasize the person's limitations, the better it's going to be for them, which is not necessarily the case. So, it's okay to ask to talk to the provider directly. Don't necessarily feel shy about that. Sometimes it's helpful to give the provider a copy of the employee's Form 30 so that they can better understand sort of what context the employee is working in, because the context that the provider sees the employee in is a medical context, right? They're not potentially thinking about how the employee is going to present at work and how that is going to sort of affect them. So giving them that context of the Form 30 or the MQ can help you get a better answer from the doctor about how the person's functional limitation is affecting their ability to work. So, and as I said, just because the doctor recommends a certain time frame doesn't mean that you have to sort of copy that over into the approval letter. You still need to use your judgment as an ADA coordinator and balance the needs of the employee against the needs of the employer to figure out what sort of operationally is going to work in terms of how long you're going to approve a request for, and if you want to have some review dates built in. So when you're granting these indefinite requests, you want to really use your judgment about what the consequences of approving an indefinite accommodation are going to be. So, the needs of the employer often change over time. An accommodation that worked really well in 2019 may have gone completely out the window in 2020 when we sort of shifted to telework, right? So we've experienced this kind of disruption before. I think disruption is going to become our norm as employers. And so, we want to be careful about calling things permanent when realistically they might not be, and sort of backing ourselves into a corner and not maintaining kind of flexibility to revise if things aren't working out. So, sometimes it will completely make sense to have a permanent accommodation request. So, for example, maybe someone needs to transfer from one work location to another because of their disability, and it just makes sense operationally for that to be a permanent transfer. It works for the business, it works for the employee, and we're all good. Go ahead, use your judgment. You can make that permanent. But things that are more sort of operational or in flux, like telework, that can be really tricky when you make that approval indefinite if sort of the needs of the agency change, the nature of the job is changing. It can be really helpful there to have built-in review periods so that if the needs of the agency change, or if it turns out that the employee really isn't able to successfully telework, that you're able to change things up. Some people are better at teleworking than others, right? So, I would say that depending on sort of the needs of the agency, the needs of the employee, an annual review of the accommodation request might be appropriate. It might be appropriate to do every 2 years or every 3 years if you find that you're just sort of checking in and everything is working well for the agency, working well with the employer. But I would start with kind of shorter intervals of review periods and then get longer as you're finding that things are working well, because you don't know at first how something is going to work. So, maybe start out with a 3-month review, a 6-month review, transition to an annual review, and then kind of maybe if it's been a couple of years and everything's going really well, you could push it out to 2 years, push it out to 3 years, so that you're not sort of increasing the amount of paperwork that you're having the employee do or yourself do, but that you're still giving the agency the opportunity to check in with the employee about how things are going. Be careful that you're not making these review periods so frequent that they're unduly burdensome on the employee. And if the medical documentation sort of supports that this is a permanent condition, you might not necessarily have to ask for new medicals each time unless you have reason to believe that something has changed. So, it takes time, effort, and money to get a doctor's note. You have to pay copay usually. So, don't put that additional burden on the employee unnecessarily. Use your judgment about what does the agency need to know in order to sort of keep this moving along. What's working for the employee, what's working for the employer. So as I said, I think it can be really helpful to add parameters to your approval. Um, Starting with a trial period of say 3 months, and then sort of looking again at sort of longer periods so that you're still checking in, but not sort of harassing the employee and making them go through the process on a really regular basis. Um, be really clear in your approval letters of exactly what is being approved and for how long. Do not let sort of the employee and the manager make assumptions about how this is all going to work. Spell it out in black and white in the letter so that everyone is on the same page. And if there's a question, you can go to that documentation and have it right there and not have to sort of reinvent the wheel. I've seen, especially when you have kind of long-term accommodations, if it's not written in the letter, people are going to make up what they think should have been written in the letter. And it can become very confusing 5-10 years down the road when different people have different ideas about what you intended 5-10 years ago. And that nobody ends up happy in those situations. And sort of, I think the natural pattern that you see is that what the employee thinks is the situation, what the employer thinks is the situation, tend to get further and further apart over time. So just be careful about that, because you don't want a situation maybe where a new manager comes in, looks at the accommodation request and says, this is not at all what we're doing right now. What's been happening for the last 5 years, and how do I sort of get this back on track? Um, you know, and as I said, it is okay to make certain types of accommodations permanent in certain situations. I'm certainly not saying that you can't do that. I would just be careful about it, be mindful about what the potential consequences of making something permanent are, and make sure that you're spelling it out really clearly in the approval letter. So I think a couple of examples that we see really often of indefinite accommodation requests. One of them is for indefinite leave. So usually this is going to happen after someone has exhausted FMLA and PFML, but they aren't ready to come back to work and they're asking for additional leave time as a reasonable accommodation. Often, I think you're going to find that indefinite leave is unduly burdensome to the employer because, particularly in a smaller workplace or a more specialized role, because the employer needs to know when that person's going to be available for work again. So, you do see courts saying, that really isn't reasonable to have a completely open-ended end date for the additional leave time. On the other hand, there have been a couple of cases where courts have upheld sort of stacked leave requests that sort of turn out functionally to be indefinite leave requests, and they've found that those are reasonable. And I think what the difference is between those indefinite leaves and the stacked leaves is that when you have, say, 11 months worth of 1 month accommodations for leave, there's a boundary there's a parameter for that leave, whereas just an open-ended, you're out until you're able to come back is, that doesn't have that parameter, and there isn't that sort of periodic check-in built in. And so, I would recommend going that stacked route rather than the sort of indefinite open-ended route. And you can say that to someone. If someone says, well, I don't know when I can come back, because that's what you usually hear, right? And the reality of bodies and disability is that sometimes you just don't know. You don't know when you're going to be able to come back to work. And that's okay. That doesn't necessarily mean that the request that you end up approving is going to be open-ended. It just means that you're going to have to be creative. So you're going to have to work with the employee and the management team to figure out like what is a reasonable interval here. Does it make sense to say, we definitely know you'll be out for the next 8 weeks. Let's check in again in 8 weeks and see how things are going, and if it makes sense to either do another leave as an accommodation or to maybe reevaluate whether you're going to be able to come back to this job ever. So I think building in those parameters is really helpful tool for you as the ADA coordinator, because you can give you can give some rope to your to the employee without sort of losing control of the situation. So and sort of and hurting the employer and their ability to sort of get their business needs done. So you're really able to balance it when you put in those parameters. And we are going to talk about leave at my training at the end of the month. So hold your horses. The other really, really frequent indefinite RA that I see is for telework. I think when somebody has a permanent condition that requires them to telework, I feel wary about making an accommodation permanent where, both people's health conditions and sort of the business needs of the office do change over time. And telework is something that's, kind of fuzzy and pretty sensitive to operational needs, right? So my recommendation there is to set periodic reviews. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a full-blown interactive process every time, but I think that it's really helpful to check in with the employee and the manager, say annually, every other year, just to be able to make sure that everyone's needs are still being met. Maybe the employee is doing really well teleworking and everything's going great. Maybe they're struggling and either they need a new accommodation or a different accommodation in order to meet their needs. So I think for me, it's something kind of fuzzy like telework. It's going to be safer for everybody involved if you set some periodic reviews just to check in and make sure everything is going. As I said before, don't make those reviews so frequent that they're burdensome on the employee. You don't want to be harassing the employee with this sort of bureaucratic process. So it's a delicate balance. And this is where our judgment as ADA coordinators comes in. How do we balance sort of the need to check in with not hounding our employees, which we do not want to do. And just be mindful that sort of frequent and repeated requests for medical documentation for a permanent condition may be considered to be discriminatory. So use your judgment when you're asking for updated medicals. If the prior medical has said that the condition is permanent, if you have no reason to think that it has changed, be careful about that. If you have sort of a a specific fact pattern, feel free to run it by me, but we don't want to be using medical documentation as a barrier for people to get accommodations that we already know that they need. So that is my quick little presentation. I've been getting a lot of questions about this topic. So I figured that bringing you all together would be a helpful way to kind of share your common questions and share some common experiences. So if you have a question, if you can type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand. If you raise your hand, please turn on your video, and before you speak, please just identify yourself with your name so we know who you are. Um, all right, Arpita, I saw you first. Oh, you're muted.
Hi. So I recently took over the ADA coordinator role. And one of the case that I just received was from an employee. She met with an accident, and this was 2 years ago. And the end result of that accident is that she had sciatica, due to which she needs, lumbar support cushion for her chair. Um, she has not submitted any paperwork, any doctor's paperwork. So I asked her, are you able to submit a doctor's paperwork? And she was like, well, yes, I can, but it's a lot of work for me because now I have to, go make the doctor's appointment, go to the doctor, ask them to do that analysis and then send you the notes. And then I think she got a little bit, and I was like, at this point I just want to ask you, because I wasn't sure as well about the process at the Commonwealth, like how do we do it, since this was my first time. And she was then like, well, if it's that big of a deal, if I have to go to the doctor and all, then I would rather just order it myself.
Okay, no, don't have her order it yourself. So you can order an ergonomic assessment for her and have someone come out and do it for her. Or if she knows exactly what she needs, and this is a pretty easy request, I don't think you necessarily need medical documentation for a lumbar support. If you have reason to think that this is if you don't have reason to doubt that she has a functional limitation there.
Okay, so what you're telling me is to order a assessment for her?
Yeah.
Okay. And
Yeah,
how
you can order an ergonomic assessment. We can talk about that offline too, but you can order an ergonomic assessment, or I mean, for a lumbar support, if you believe her, I don't know that you necessarily need a medical note for a.
Okay. Yeah, because I was talking to the managers of that department, and even to our labor relation person, and they told that we do need a doctor's because it's the whole process, right? Like we need medical documentation.
Well, you're the ADA coordinator, so you are the subject matter expert here, not the managers. And if there is, if in a circumstance where the person's need for specific accommodation is obvious, you cannot require them to submit medical paperwork. That's considered discriminatory. So if her need for this particular accommodation is obvious, then you do not need paperwork. If it's not obvious, then that's a different story, right? So, but I would use your discretion as the ADA coordinator to say, this seems, I don't. Have you met with her? Like, is she sort of presenting as needing that kind of support? Is there other documentation? I mean, if it was a workers' comp injury, is there documentation from her workers' comp case? What do you have here that you can rely on? And do you really need to be asking for the medical documentation? Would be my question. And you can always order an ergonomic assessment. That is a tool in your toolkit as well. But you are the ADA coordinator, so you're the one who calls the shots here about what's necessary.
Okay, thank you.
Kate Sawyer.
Hello. So I think I know the answer, but just like kind of confirmation. So past practice at the agency I'm at is if someone has a workers' comp reasonable accommodation, that it's always been that people feel like they have to do the reasonable accommodation they're asking because they've been injured at work. So sometimes it's created circumstances where the person can't meet the essential functions of their job. So to me, if they can't meet the essential functions of their job, it's not a reasonable accommodation. So I just want to confirm that even if it's workers' comp, like we still have to be able to give an accommodation for them to be able to complete their job duties. There isn't like an exception where like it's a must do or okay.
We're gonna go into like that intersection between ADA and workers' comp more at the end of the month.
Okay.
And so definitely come to that. Or if you can't come to it, it will be recorded and will be on our YouTube. But yeah, the workers' comp doesn't, because you've gotten workers' comp doesn't mean that you have an end round around sort of the definition of disability, which is qualified individual with a disability. You still have to be qualified. You still have to be able to complete the essential functions of the job.
Perfect. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Julia, I just have a follow-up question. Can I ask you now or?
Yeah.
Okay. How do you how do I assess the need when it's not obvious that, what is it that she needs at work? Like I do have to go to the manager for that, right? For those informations.
What I'm not sure what you mean by what she needs. So you mean like whether her medical condition means that she needs like a lumbar support or whether.
Yeah, so like she's saying that she needs a lumbar support. Now, how do I know if she really need a lumbar support to do the work that she's doing? And again, this is one situation, but in other situations where I do connect with managers, right, to determine if the person's need, what the person need at work. Mm-hmm. Is this really necessary? Like we do have those interactive dialogue with the managers as well.
Well, so you should be talking to the employee, right? So first off, the manager doesn't get any medical information about the employee, right?
Yes.
So you're not giving the manager any medical documentation, any sort of information about diagnosis. You're only really talking to the manager about what the limitation is and how it affects her ability to be at work. Right. And you're going to talk to the employee herself about sort of, tell me what's going on, tell me what's going on at work. It sounds like you're having some back pain. Tell me about how that's affecting you on the job. How long, how long are you having to sit? Are you, what does your workflow look like? Does it help if you're able to sort of stand up and walk around? Do you need to be sitting for extended periods of time? Are you sort of driving for extended periods of time? Sort of what is the setup of your job? What are some things that you've tried that have helped already? Is there anything that you're doing at home that's helping? And I think having that kind of, asking a ton of questions of the person is going to pull out a lot of information. And then if, you can use your professional judgment to say, something seems a little odd here. I'm not really sure that what this person is saying they need is, matches up with what I would expect their medicals to say. So I'm going to ask for medical confirmation. You're especially going to do that in the case where they're asking for something that is, harder to accomplish, right? So if they're asking for telework, and, that's a pretty big deal for some agencies, full-time telework, because we have sort of in-person attendance requirements.
Right.
So if the accommodation that they're requesting is going to put some strain on the agency, maybe it's still reasonable, but it's going to put some strain there. That's when you're sort of checking in and saying, like, is there something else that can work? Because the doctor's note can also provide you with ideas about alternatives, right? Well, maybe teleworking full time isn't going to work for the agency, but being able to change your schedule so that you're avoiding peak commute times would. And getting that feedback from the medicals can be really helpful in narrowing down sort of the parameters of the accommodation that you're granting. Um, you know, where I think that something like an ergonomic tool is kind of on the line, and I do think that that's where the ergonomic assessment can be really helpful, because we have our own vendors that do that. So I would use your discretion, and are you what are the blanks that you're looking to fill in with the doctor's note?
Okay. Okay. And then we do have these tools. Like if you don't have the doctor's note, then we can request this, that, okay, let's do an ergonomic assessment and
Yeah.
then, and if she's okay with that.
Right.
But we do need something, right? Like it cannot be that, oh, she's asking me for something and I just order it because I feel like, okay, she has this condition and she's
No, you
asking.
absolutely could. I mean, if you believe her and you think that there is a reason, I mean, if someone who is, if I hire a new employee who's blind and they ask me for JAWS, there is no way that I'm asking for medical documentation for that. It's very clear that they need this in order to do their job, and I'm just going to order it.
But what about, I think my question is also, now that this is again a follow-up question, is she orders something and it's making it worse. Like, like it's not coming from the medical provider, right? It's not coming from, like she feels that, okay, maybe a cushion will help me. And that's why she just ordered a cushion and we accepted the accommodation, we paid for it. Or we ordered it because she asked us to do that, but it's making the pain worse. Like that could be a situation too, right?
Yeah, so that's why you'd have an erg assessment.
Okay. And if she doesn't do that, or if she's not ready for that, then what do we do?
Well, that's how she gets what she wants. So
Okay.
you explain that to her.
Okay, yeah, no, that's what I just want to know. Okay.
All right, Allison.
Morning, everybody. Allison Zimmern from Division of Occupational Licensure. I'm the Assistant General Counsel of Labor and Employment. I recently was handling the ADA requests along with Lori Hindle, our COO, who could not be here today. And Arpita has graciously come in to take over that duty from us, but I still have a hand in it. So thank you for having this program today. And I really, a lot of what you said resonated with my experience over the last year in handling these more indefinite requests. I have a little, just a permutation of that seems to be the indefinite intermittent requests. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions about handling those, and in particular, how to support managers with, for lack of a better word, tracking those, because it's not easy for them to do, but we also don't want to sounds terrible, but let folks kind of have more than what we've already worked out that we
Right.
feel is appropriate to give them in terms of maybe a schedule flexibility or something
Right.
like that.
So is this like an intermittent leave after they've exhausted their FMLA, or?
No, we have at least one person I can think of who has a chronic condition will be indefinite, that from week to week, we've allowed her to change her in-office day and her day in the field. And she basically just can decide
Yeah,
kind of on the fly, like, oh, I don't feel good today. And I'm
right,
not trying to minimize her condition at all, but just, I'm not
right.
feeling up to working in the office today, but I can work at home. So I'm going to switch my day in the office to a
Right.
different day.
I mean, I think that that is that is the pain point there is the tracking, right?
Mhm.
And that is where you start to ask yourself what the burden is on the employer, right? Like, is this becoming like too much administrative work for the agency to support? Um, I've used a calendar for that
Mhm.
situation where I've color coded it with, purple are the days that they're in the office and blue are the days that they're at home. And
Okay.
that is visually
Yeah.
that really helped me sort of
Yeah.
track whether they were taking more or less than they were supposed to be. But I think that using kind of calendaring tools could be helpful for the manager, or kind of, and I think checking in with that manager periodically is in order to see, like, is this working? Are you still, like, if she's not able to be in the field this day, what's the consequence of that over time? Maybe this has been going on for 6 months and she's missed, six, field visits that she was, normally assigned to handle. How's that affecting the other people on her team? um, I would kind of be asking those questions to see, is this as reasonable as we thought it would be when we approved it? And that's why I like check-ins, because often in theory it seems really reasonable for a manager because they're not thinking about how it is going to be to live with this accommodation on their team for 6 months, 5 years, 12 years. They're not thinking about the cumulative effect of it.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's definitely been an issue. And also I've had the same on the flip side, the manager thinks it's going to be much worse
Right. And that,
operationally than it actually is. And I have to
right.
be the one to calm them down and say, look,
Yeah.
this person is legally entitled to this. So let's not panic. Like, let's just see how it goes and not assume that it's going to be misused or terrible.
That's why I love a 3-month trial too, because it's a short enough time period that you can say, all right, we're not approving this forever. Let's see how it works. And we're not marrying it. If it doesn't work, we're going to revisit it and figure out what's going to work better. But as a sort of, we're not going to know until we try. So let's
Right.
just see if it's as bad as we think it's going to be. And, you're right. Sometimes it's not that bad. And they're, they come around after 3 months.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions out there? I know EEA specifically asked for this one, so if EEA has any, I'm all ears. All right, no hands. Well, I will give you a quarter of an hour back in your morning. Thank you guys so much for coming. If you have questions, please follow up with me. I think you know how to get me. It's julia.e.o'leary@mass.gov. Oh, there are questions in the chat? Oh, I do have a question in the chat. Can you touch on ADA accommodations for travel to the office? Can you tell me what you mean by that, Sharani? So ADA accommodations for travel to the office, it's kind of like a hot topic because there is, if we're talking about like are we talking about commuting assistance or?
Good morning. Sorry, I disconnected. So yeah, so if we could touch on like because I know typically ADA we don't approve for travel, but what are the limitations on that?
Really, it's a really great area. So, it depends. I mean, are we talking about like, so somebody's asking for like the agency to provide like an Uber to work, or?
Well, no, it's more of the employees having trouble, I guess, some sort of health issues when they travel to work. So they're requesting to work indefinitely from home where it doesn't work operationally.
Well, so I think
And they want to have it like that open-ended where it's like, oh, when that flares up, then I want to be able to like work from home. But the way, I guess like before my time, they had approved it, and the way that the employee was using it was consistent with the employee was not really coming in at all.
Okay, so I think you've got kind of two things going on. So one, my first approach would be, if teleworking is not compatible with their essential job functions, they're going to just take telework off the table. If they need to be in the office in order to work, that's sort of the end of that conversation. And think about, are there other ways that you can get this employee into the office in a way that's not going to sort of impact their disability? So maybe the problem with the commute is that, it takes 2.5 hours to drive into the city, and that just takes a huge toll on their back because the peak driving hours, she has to come down Route 1 and it's just a parking lot. I would say, is there a way that you can modify the hours that she's driving in?
We've tried that.
We've tried that. And that didn't work.
We've tried, yeah, that doesn't work. Yeah, that didn't work. Or it's not working.
It's not working. So she just needs to work from home. I mean, can you give her the option to take leave on the days that she can't go
So
in?
yes, that's another issue that so since it wasn't a reasonable accommodation that we were able to approve, she went on a leave, an approved
Intermittent
leave, an intermittent leave, but is using it in a way where it's consistent, it's consistently on the days that she has to be in the office.
Yep. Oh yeah. There's like nothing that you can do about that. Probably. It's very tough. Very, very tough. Once they're on an approved FMLA leave, the sort of that reasonableness factor that we have under the ADA really goes by the wayside. And that FMLA leave is very protected. So, and we're going to talk about that a lot in my next training.
Even though they've shown like a consistent pattern of like that, using it for not coming in.
Oh yeah. I dealt with this. It's really tough. So this might be one that we want to talk about offline.
Yeah, sure.
Because I think it's kind of going to be a little thorny. So why don't you book some time on my calendar, and we can try to tease through what some options might be. Those are really, really hard. And I think, that's when you start talking about, are you, if you're not able to do this job, is there something else that we can offer you in the agency? Or, are we talking about, potentially, I mean, when you've got someone on an intermittent FMLA, you don't want to be talking about potential separation. So you really want to be thinking about like, what else do I have for you? What else can we, be doing for you until we can get this done because you need her to do her
I mean,
work.
the employee's been using it in a way where it's consistent with a part-time schedule, so that's why I'm trying to explore to see if that's something I can
Yeah, that
offer.
might work. Yeah.
But yeah, we could talk about.
Okay. Yeah, let's talk about that offline. All right. Beautiful. I think that those are all the questions. The recording is going to be on our YouTube page. So I'll make sure you all have the link to that afterwards. But our YouTube page is great. If you haven't checked it out yet, I have a lot of my trainings recorded on there, and that's where I put them all once I have them. So check it out. Thank you guys so much. And I am really excited about my ADA and different types of protected leave training that's coming up at the end of the month. So please join us. I think that's on the 26th. And again, if you can't make it to that, it will be recorded. So never fear. Thank you guys so much and have a great afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.